Well, good morning again, everybody. And I'm here to introduce Alice Cohen. She's a lived experience expert and compassionate educator specializing in early identification and behavioral intervention of traumatized children. In 2019, she established SAFE, that is, Survivors of Familial Exploitation, to close the gap in available research and develop survivor-informed resources for direct service providers, as well as operate as a forum providing therapeutic support, resources, and career guidance to survivors of familial exploitation. Ms. Cohen previously worked for the National Suicide Hotline, training volunteers and as a school-based behavioral therapist, before receiving certification as a special educator for early childhood exceptional children. Ms. Cohen has her bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Delaware and is completing her master's in education at Wilmington University. She loves photography and spending her free time hiking the trails of southern Chester County, Pennsylvania, with her 3 dogs and teenage daughter. And so hopefully we'll not be distracted too much longer, and we welcome Alicia.
Hello. I am so happy to be here to discuss such an important topic that receives fairly little attention in the anti-trafficking field. But before I get started, I do want to provide a brief reminder that we are entering into a difficult conversation about family members who sell their children for sexual purpose and monetary gain. So please take good care of yourself. If you start to feel emotional or numb, stand up, stretch, take a break, engage your senses. It's perfectly okay with me if you need to exit the room and come back in. So I also wanted to include our National Crisis Line number here in case you need to talk to someone immediately. That number is 988. And a special acknowledgement to Jeanne Alert. A lot of the quotes I have pulled from her research for today's presentation, and I highly suggest reading it. A link is included in the master handout for this presentation. So a bit about me. I won't share much more than what was already shared. I am a special educator and anti-trafficking advocate. I teach second graders with learning differences. My life is full now, full of fun and laughter and love, but it has not always been like this. When I was 4 years old, my parents loaded my 2-year-old brother and I into a U-Haul, and we drove cross-country from Delaware to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where my father was to attend seminary for a year, and I was to attend a small preschool that was attached to the seminary. I remember learning all of my letters in print and cursive, something we don't do anymore. The year progressed and came to a conclusion without much incident. My father finished seminary and planned a vacation with my mother to visit Canada before we made the trip back to the East Coast. I was to stay with a family of a little girl from my preschool class. I remember being really nervous about being away from my mom for an entire week because before that I had only been away from her for much more than an evening maybe. But the time arrived and I was brought to my friend's house. And I remember she had a beautiful canopy bed for herself and a matching one for her American Girl doll. So the last thing I remember doing before my parents left was just kind of gazing at the intricate details of this doll's nightgown. Her long blonde hair resembled mine at the time, and I was told if I were good, I could have my own American Girl doll upon my parents' return. My parents were gone maybe 1 minute before my little friend turned to me and said, "Daddy says it's your turn now," and skipped out of the room. Later, her mom brought me a white nightgown that resembled the doll's. She brushed my blonde curls, told me I was going to be a movie star. I soon came to the understanding that my father was receiving a large sum of money for my compliance that week. And a week later, my parents came back to pick me up, but I was not the same girl they dropped off. I was difficult and defiant. I had outbursts and tantrums. The trafficking continued, and it did not stop until I was 12 years old. And at that time, I had already started to show signs of psychological distress alongside the physical symptoms associated with trafficking. And around 8, 9 years old, I was actually pulled out of private Christian school and placed in homeschooling. It is often those years that I refer to as the dark years because I have very little memory of those years. By the time I was 8, I was already self-harming, and that's an addiction that continued well into adulthood. By the time I was 12 years old, I was showing signs of such extreme distress that I was diagnosed with ADD. I had 2 suicide attempts in college, and 1 more in my early 30s during a time when I was experiencing economic and housing insecurity. However, it was that last attempt that really set me on a trajectory towards health. It was the first time I was able to be open and honest, not just with the professionals caring for me, but also with myself. I received the appropriate therapy I needed. I explored the creative arts. I mothered a gorgeous child. I earned a master's degree and found community. But all the while, I had so many questions. How had I been missed? And why didn't someone say something? Why didn't someone see something? Because I remember people being around, people who were not involved in the trafficking during the trafficking experiences. So I was terrified that other children were being missed, and I still am terrified. So here I am today because it has been quite the journey, and I want to share with you what I've learned about familial trafficking along the way so that we can all make sure together that children can be identified while they are still young enough to have a childhood. So before I really get started, I want to take a moment to kind of assess what the current thinking is here in the room. So what images come to your mind when you think of parents and parenthood and families in general, right? Who do you think is making child sex abuse material, also known as child porn? Where do you think those children come from? So I first came to understand human trafficking as an outside predator manipulating people and adolescents, young adults, with promises of love and drugs and money. And I was unable to identify as a survivor myself until much later in adulthood because that description just failed to match my own reality. That the predator was not someone outside the home, but my own father exploiting his position in my young life as my parent. So we can formally define familial trafficking as family members or other caregivers selling their children for sexual purposes in exchange for money, drugs, or something else of value. And that will include manufacturing and exchanging of child pornography, as this material is valuable in its own right, serving as currency for access for other products and services, namely other children. So similar to other forms of child abuse, exploitation of very young children generally occurs at the hands of a trusted individual who has continuous access to that victim. It is just extremely rare for a young child to be exploited by a stranger. These crimes then have a pervasive impact on the child, altering their development and life trajectory across all domains, and that makes it one of the most severest forms of child abuse known to our country. So familial trafficking is very well documented and one of the officially recognized forms of sex trafficking by our United States government. However, all signs point to it being grotesquely underdetected, and that brings me back to my questions of why. Research tends to point to lack of training and lack of expertise, but perhaps a greater challenge is personal bias. People do not want to believe that a parent or caregiver would perpetrate such extreme abuse on a child. We want to believe that the home is safe, that it is the best place for children to grow up. And that personal bias is extremely powerful. We interpret everything through a filter that is formed by our own experiences, our own knowledge, and our own belief systems. So personal bias can then cloud your ability to see what is happening right in front of you. So Polaris data points to approximately 15% of all human trafficking here in the United States occurring at the hands of a family or a legal guardian. And that makes the extent of family involvement in the trafficking of children up to 4 times higher than adult cases, right? So yes, there are very complicated schemes involving prominent individuals who will sex traffic children, possibly out of pizza parlors, but probably not. And children are also sometimes kidnapped and sold. But these things are not common. What is more common is much more terrifying, right? That parents are exploiting their own children. They are exploiting innate vulnerabilities like proximity, trust, and naivety. And those children then attend our private and public schools. They attend Sunday school at our churches. They are brought in for medical attention at our hospitals. And all the while they go unnoticed as needing of assistance. So who traffics these children? Well, what I'm about to say should not be a big surprise, as it is an accurate reflection of demographics here in the United States. But data consistently points to most familial traffickers being white, middle class, living in a suburban or rural setting. I belong to a group of adult survivors of familial trafficking. There are about 50 of us. 90% of us are white, 80% were raised in Christian and Catholic families, and 40% were trafficked by our mothers and 40% by our fathers, the other 20% being trafficked by a grandparent, uncle, aunt, a live-in family friend, and also a foster parent. So does anything there surprise you? Because if you are surprised by something I said, that might shed a bit of light into your own bias, right? So familiar survivors were then asked to list the locations where the trafficking occurred, and this is what they said. The family home, the buyer's home, church, an office building, flea markets, truck stops, a barn or shed, a campsite, a field, prayer meetings, rodeos, hotel motels, warehouses, and military base. So what jumps out at you? Well, what jumps out at me is that most of these locations are private and isolated and not necessarily somewhere where many other people would be. However, some of these locations are not private and isolated. Sometimes they were used during odd hours when little people would be frequently the building, but other times they absolutely were not. So again, I go back to why didn't someone see something? And if they did see something, why didn't someone say something? I think maybe people are seeing, they just aren't believing what they are seeing. I also think bias plays a big role in the fact that some of these locations were chosen not because they were private, but because they were safe spaces and not somewhere where people would consider trafficking to occur. And that then allows the traffickers to get away with their crimes hidden in plain sight, right? So familial traffickers tend to fall into 2 different categories. Half are motivated by drug dependency. Children in this situation are usually identified during a drug trafficking investigation by law enforcement or as a result of neglect or truancy investigation by the school and social services. This type of trafficking is likely to have third-party involvement, typically a grandparent or a boyfriend who's kind of circling that parent and exploiting their dependency to substances. The other half are motivated by sociopathy and a malignant need for power, admiration, and control. These families are already financially viable, and the trafficker lives this then double life working really hard to connect with other powerful figures in the community while keeping their family in a constant state of turmoil at home. It is extremely difficult to identify victims within this group, as these traffickers tend to be well-respected members of their community. In fact, within these homes, almost 100% of these children are left to self-identify as an adult. The trafficker may be associated with other powerful organizations and befriend board members, judges, police officers, other government officials, and church leaders. The sociopath is calm and calculating and obsessed with appearances. They are charming and charismatic and make a point of making a positive impression with you, all the while thinking, your rules do not apply to me. You might find these families to be snobbish or weird. They may break boundaries regarding your physical space and your personal time and even your property. They lack respect for your resources and your social norms. These are all signs of pathological entitlement. So how do these family members control and traffic their children? There is a myriad of covert dynamics at play here, and none of this dysfunction is going to be blatantly obvious within the community. They work hard to silence their victims through discrediting, gaslighting, and isolating. They use threats of death and injury and financial destitution. It is really common for this child to be completely terrified of system involvement. They also manipulate the education and healthcare systems to their advantage. Some traffickers might only traffic during school holidays. Some, like my experience, take the child out of school altogether, opting for homeschool or virtual learning. So in fact, a 2018 focus group in Louisiana identified homeschool children as a group at risk for sex trafficking. And my group shows this as well, with members being homeschooled at 5 times the national average. One reason behind this is that some abusers will use lax homeschooling laws to their advantage, pulling the child from traditional school so they cannot disclose the abuse to a trusted adult. Another way to manipulate systems is to delay presentation of the child to a medical setting following a trafficking episode, and to make sure that minimal physical injuries are discernible at that time. The trafficker will absolutely insist on being present during any evaluation or examination, no matter how intrusive or invasive they are being. There's just never any one-on-one time spent with other adults unless they are approved by the trafficker and typically part of the trafficking circle. The familial trafficker can be extremely uncooperative, not showing up for appointments, not returning phone calls or emails, and not answering questions directly. They are always full of excuses. But above all, within these families is a culture of secrecy, and that insulates the trafficker from disclosure. And this secrecy develops as a result of emotional and physical closeness to the child, combined with high levels of confinement, threats of harm, and dominance. So it is really common to isolate the child even within the walls of the home by triangulating communication patterns amongst family members. And they do this by filtering and controlling conversations to their advantage. Another extremely common tool is the physical abuse of pets. And this instills harm and fear in the child of physical harm, right? And these threats will not be just directed at the child's physical safety, but of the other family members. And that creates this strong desire within the child to protect the family system. And that means that these crimes will just continue to occur until someone is trained enough and observant enough to ask the right questions and understand the answers that they are being given. So the age of the child is also really important. The grooming and breaking for this age group will start in infancy and toddlerhood, and exposure to pornographic images of adults will begin as young as 3 or 4 years old. Most of these children are then just so young that they lack a frame of reference to understand what is happening to them, And the abuse just becomes ongoing and normalized. It becomes embedded in the everyday life of the child. All this traumatic stress then begins to cause cognitive dysfunctions in the child, primarily in the form of memory and dissociation, and that, like memory loss and dissociation, and that protects the child from the emotional pain associated with the trafficking events, but it also protects the trafficker from consequences. It's also really, really, really typical to give the child drugs such as Benadryl or cough syrup, these over-the-counter medications that render a child compliant and sleepy. These substances are really easily accessible and used in the majority of such cases. However, if the trafficker is substance dependent or the compliant parent is substance dependent, then harder drugs can be used as well. Gaslighting then in these cases might include telling a child they were dreaming and convincing them that their experience just never happened at all. Lastly, these children are not typically advertised in the same manner as adults or adolescent victims of human trafficking. They are not being advertised on the internet like that. Their advertisement is taking place via word of mouth, and that makes it extremely hard for outside agencies to detect the crime and locate the victim. The traffickers have general and also specific language for finding others with similar interests. They then trade children with other families and in this way form connections within the community for power and control. So I want to take a moment to discuss religion as a use of a tool for the trafficking parent. Most of these families are religiously observant, and half of survivors report spiritual abuse as a means to facilitate their trafficking. So how is this then done? And is it the same as ritual abuse? Well, religious abuse refers to the psychological manipulation of another individual using religious doctrine. And when this is used against the child, this type of religiously based psychological abuse just dominates the child through fear, indoctrinating them with the abuser's beliefs while suppressing all other perspectives. So within religious abuse, we also see authoritarian control, where the trafficking parent will align themselves with God, making themselves the utmost authority and power. Any fears and traumatic behaviors exhibited by the child can then be explained by supernatural influences. It is also common for these families to use enmeshment as a means to control their children. And enmeshment is a psychological term used to describe a parent who does not allow their child to think independently or hold views that differ from their own. This is extremely toxic to the child and inhibits a healthy formation of their own identity. It crushes the child's chance to form their own morality and belief system. And that is then combined with the use of fear and a judgmental environment such as hell to control the child. It makes the child literally reliant on the religion of the abuser, and they never learn to reflect critically on any information they receive. So this then is distinct from ritual abuse, which is also referred to as organized abuse, where the child is abused and exploited during religious rituals by a group of people. So although there is much overlap between these two types of abuses, they do remain very distinct. Ritual abuse represents maybe 10-15% of all familial cases. Another factor I kind of want to throw in as a side note is international adoptions from trafficking hotspots in third world countries by our domestic predators here in the United States. And that then is a form of a child bride, right? It's a modern take where the child is then brought over into the United States and utilized in sexual servitude. So now I'd like to discuss the other family members, because this does not happen in a box, right? There are other family members involved. There are usually other siblings living in the house. It is typical for one parent to be consciously unaware of the trafficking, even if they are aware of it at an unconscious level. The trafficking does remain a secret between the child and a trafficker, and this other parent can be an amazing asset to the child, acting as a buffer for some of the most severe effects of abuse on the child's development, even though they absolutely enable and are responsible for the abuse. The parent can be either male or female and will typically have their own history of childhood sexual abuse. They may have also been trafficked themselves, either in adulthood or as a child, with intergenerational familial trafficking being prevalent at about 15%. This parent is then both a victim to the family system and also responsible for the abuse. They choose to live in this state of denial, protecting themselves despite their child. They enable the emotional and mental abuse, causing the child to question their memories. They might do this by telling the child they are untrustworthy, that the child cannot survive without the family system. They will also typically reinforce very strict gender norms, training the child to please male dominance. And that's also done through this religious abuse, right? Because those are all constructs that can be a conservative religion. There is typically domestic violence in this home, and the compliant parent suffers mental, emotional, sexual, and financial abuse, making them feel very dependent and submissive to the other parent. So that then brings us to the other siblings in the family. A tool to isolate and target a trafficked child is to only traffic one sibling at a time. Only a small number of survivors actually say that their siblings were aware of their abuse and possibly being trafficked themselves. This leaves a lot of room to say, well, the other children are fine and not complaining, so this one then must be lying, mentally unwell, or maybe just completely sick. These families will typically have a favorite child. They'll compare siblings, demeaning the trafficked child for lack of talent and skill, and ensuring a competitive spirit amongst the siblings. So within these families, you might notice that siblings behave differently. You might notice that the boys seem to have a lot of friends, they're comfortable with their body, they're engaged in community activities like sports. Perhaps then you notice that the girl child stays at home and is incredibly fearful. You might notice she is socially and physically awkward, prone to angry outbursts. So perhaps then you might say to yourself, maybe this is a child that needs to be noticed. So why don't these children just tell? Well, I argue it's not realistic for a child to tell. It is not realistic for the individual to tell so long as they have continued contact with that trafficking parent. Most individuals are just so entangled with the trafficker, like well into adulthood, even years after the explicit abuse ends. And this then speaks volume to just how difficulty such extraction is from this type of family. It is really difficult to protect oneself from ongoing exposure to the perpetrator. And it also represents just an enduring threat of psychological and physical safety to that survivor. Another barrier to identification is simple community disbelief. Conversations amongst survivors have revealed that most did try to tell an adult about their trafficking at some time. Some tried to tell a caretaker, school, or church personnel, someone with whom they had established a safe relationship with, a connection with. But because these children are traumatized, they lack typical cognitive and communication skills to communicate. So all of their communications are then very vague when they're speaking about unsafety. So you'll see a lot of shrugging of shoulders and simple noddings of heads. The adults then typically assess these situations. They assess the legitimacy of the child's complaint themselves and fail to report to the appropriate agencies. So it is impossible to discuss these warning signs for this age group without discussing developmental indicators. Familial trafficking, again, is one of the most severe forms of child abuse in our country. It has a pervasive impact on the child. It alters their development and life trajectory across domains. So behaviorally, the child will have a tendency to self-harm. They can quickly oscillate between aggression and unquestioning compliance. They may also struggle with impulsiveness, defiance, and being extremely withdrawn, preferring to remain as invisible as possible. That child has adapted to survive, and the locations just matter not to that child's mind. So survival behaviors will carry from the child's home and into benign environments like the classroom. This then has very practical implication. Cognitively, the child will really struggle to attend to tasks and retain information and recall previously learned skills. It's just simply too hard to attend to tasks if you are constantly scanning the room for signs of impending danger. So at school, this means that trauma and learning differences such as ADHD present very similarly and are often easily confused. So it's always really important to look for those dissociative elements of trauma before labeling a child with a learning disability. Socially, the child may be distrusting of adults. They may respond to the world as if in constant threat or danger. They will typically have a very difficult time developing healthy peer relationships with others and also with themselves. A strong relationship with yourself requires awareness of your own preferences and strengths, and that awareness is a luxury that survival simply does not afford, and the trafficking parent will actually actively discourage by, again, not allowing the child to hold views or engage in activities that are independent from their own. Emotionally, the child will struggle with dysregulation, shame, despair, feelings of failure. They may have difficulty with change or uncertainty, as well as difficulty identifying nuanced emotional states. These individuals tend to be black and white thinkers, not understanding all those shades of gray. And that brings me to a really important point. Familial trafficking victims are highly likely to be evaluated by school or medical personnel for a variety of reasons. So I want to point out what sticks out with me concerning the evaluation process. The evaluation is likely to be triggered by something along the lines of the following: panic, sleep disturbance, self-harm, a victim of bullying or the bullier, difficulty maintaining friendships, suicidality, high absentee rate, ADD or LD diagnosis, a learning disability diagnosis, along with frequent complaints to the school nurse for very vague somatic issues like my stomach hurts, I'm tired, my head hurts, those kinds of things. So signs of parental neglect or drug use in the home will also trigger an evaluation. And although these children are likely to come into contact with healthcare providers and the child welfare system, it seems that at all points of contact with these systems, they're failing to identify the abuse altogether or mislabeling it as simple sexual abuse and not identifying that commercial component. So an adult with this type of childhood will then remain stuck with these behaviors that made survival possible even when they are no longer useful. This then will take an economic toll on the individual who is at high risk for suicide, substance abuse, increased encounters with law enforcement, and re-entry into trafficking via a more typical manner like a boyfriend or a pimp. The adult survivor will experience depression, demoralization, hopelessness, disconnection, fatigue, distress, difficulty starting and finishing tasks, paranoia, unstable friendships and romantic relationships, a global sense of unsafety, feelings of impending doom, and a preoccupation with threats, whether those are real or imagined. We also see an extremely high rate of self-harming behavior, both in adulthood and in childhood. So why do so many survivors self-harm? Well, it's a way to communicate those unmet safety needs through actions when you can't do so verbally. It's a maladaptive way to make themselves feel better by distancing their thinking from the abuse and all the emotions associated with the abuse. So I know it sounds funny, but self-harming actually releases positive feeling chemicals in the brain through endorphin rushes, and that can quickly become addictive. So how do these kiddos discover that self-harm feels good? Well, typically in the general populations, typical adolescents will discover self-harm from peers or in the media or social apps, right? But for others, self-harm begins in young childhood via nail biting, scratching, skin picking, head banging, and hair pulling. These things might not qualify as self-harm for necessarily everyone, but for some it represents a very slippery slope. So what should you do if you suspect a child may be a victim of familial exploitation? Well, intervention will occur in stages ranging from immediate to long-term. First off, when dealing with the child, never intervene directly. You could put yourself and the child in danger. Rather, establish a safe, predictable, transparent relationship with that child. Make sure they know they can come to you and ask you questions about how they feel. In the meantime, if you notice behavioral indicators, you absolutely should file a report for suspected child abuse with your local child protective agency, and you can do that anonymously if needed. You can call the human trafficking hotline to document your suspicions for trafficking. You can contact the child's school and ask to speak with the child's counselor about your concerns. You can call the hotline for missing and exploited children. If you have concrete evidence like eyewitness testimony or photographic or video evidence, you can also file with the police department in the county where the crime is occurring. And if that doesn't work, because I've had this happen to me, you can escalate by speaking with your local FBI agents. And if that doesn't work, you can escalate by speaking with your local Homeland Security agents. But just a word of caution, anything that gets back to the trafficker can put the child's safety at risk. So be diligent, but be really careful. So we had a conversation amongst survivors about what helped them get through their trafficking experience, and I was really surprised to see a lot of similar responses. People said sports, books, academics, and creative activities were helpful. These are all things that are regulating and affirming, but also distancing from the self and the outside world, so from your internal and external world. Over-focus then on these activities is an adaptive and socially acceptable way of dissociating, and that then is typically overlooked as being an indicator of distress. So it's typical for these survivors to excel at school, have model behavior, with the classroom just being one of the few safe places where they ever feel safety and where they receive affirmation and validation. So once confirmed for trafficking, both the physical and psychological safety will be paramount to the victim. They will need safe and predictable space to heal. That means stabilization of housing, income, and education. And then what will follow is long-term hard work with an emphasis on choice, strengths, and preferences, emotional literacy, and regulation of the central nervous system through connection with the self and with others. So when survivors were asked then what helped them during the recovery process, a lot of these responses were also similar. They included trauma-specific therapy and flexible schedules, community connection, exercise and movement, creative activities, spiritual connection, nature and outdoor activities, emotional support animals, books on PTSD and trauma, crisis hotline supports, virtual survivor groups, and sensory items like aromatherapy, weighted blankets, and fidgets. Most survivors, I don't want to say most, but a lot of survivors eventually start helping others on their own healing journey or in spreading awareness. And this then provides a sense of purpose to their experiences. It helps give them control over the narrative of their own story. So when working with survivors of such extreme abuse and torture, you'll always want to normalize emotional states, minimize stressors, and identify triggering stimuli, meet these unmet needs, teach life skills and emotional literacy. The greatest gift you can provide a survivor of familial trafficking is a reliable relationship over time, including relationship with other survivors. That connection is perhaps the single most healing element outside of regulation. Without connection, it is just impossible to establish the trust and social skills needed to successfully navigate the world. So again, you can teach the value of exploring preferences, strengths, and talents. This might take some work because oftentimes these survivors have never had the luxury of thinking, what am I good at? What am I interested in? What do I like and what do I dislike? A trafficking parent does not afford the luxury of such thinking, and they actually actively discourage that. So these questions might initially throw the survivor into a stupor. Survivors will need to learn emotional literacy that I've been talking about, and that's how to identify, express, and feel their emotions safely. You can help them have realistic expectations regarding their internal emotional states where bad feelings don't last forever, and bad feelings don't last forever, and bad situations also don't last forever. There are solutions for every problem and people to help. They are no longer alone. The systems and people are not the enemy. That was a lie told to them by the trafficker. So offer reminders to engage in regulating systems, as a triggered brain will have difficulty recalling these learned skills and remembering to do so. So we can discuss the importance of brain regulating activities further, as this is really important. The child survivor is left with hypervigilance, their body being wired to respond to danger really quickly. So we call that environmental stimuli that elicits that response a trigger. And that trigger is always associated with a previous traumatic event, whether the survivor is consciously aware of it or not. The emotional response can be fear, panic, anxiety, or agitation, and people will often describe feeling as if they are walking on eggshells around the survivor, never knowing what will set them off next. So the triggers are really specific to the individual as they go back to the original trauma experience. So what might some triggers be for familial survivors? The list here is really long, and I'm not going to read it because we are getting short on time. But all of these are signs to the survivor's brain that they are unsafe, and that then triggers the fight or flight or freeze response. Again, it's not all inclusive. No two situations are ever the same. But when the brain is triggered, it goes into this dysregulated state. And at the time, the primary job for the survivor, and you, if you are working with the survivor, is to help the brain re-regulate. The survivor may have never, ever felt truly calm before, as they're living in just this constant state of triggered irritability since infancy. So again, with the focus being on combating an overwhelmed or underwhelmed system, we want to engage the senses with rhythm and try to get ahead of triggers with a flexible schedule, frequent breaks, good nutrition, and lots of sleep. So since regulating activities are specific to the individuals, I would suggest that part of the work they do while exploring their preferences is to see what they find most relaxing. You can try weighted blankets and deep pressure, movements such as walking, singing, or rocking, dancing, coloring, and painting. These are all just rules of thumb. Again, it's individual to the survivor. The amount of time spent doing these activities may feel really extreme in the beginning. Survivors just starting their healing journey will have to spend the majority of their days just regulating and re-regulating themselves, but eventually the time spent just being dysregulated will gradually decrease, and the amount that the survivor feels calm will increase. So I'd like to take just a quick moment to discuss delayed recall for these narrative events, also known as recovered or repressed memories, although I really dislike those terms. It's actually the brain healing. So as the survivor begins to work on these brain regulating activities, they'll start to notice a decreased amount of this brain fog for their own personal historic events. That's the dissociation lifting and the reassociation between the brain and the body occurring. And that allows recall when the survivor feels safe and calm. But unfortunately, the process of gaining clarity is really traumatic in its own right. The memories typically don't come back in chronological order. They are overlapping and segmented, and that makes it really confusing to sort through, particularly if substances were used during the trafficking experience. This reassociation includes not just the narrative memory, it also includes the emotions, smells, sounds, and touch. All the senses will hold their own experiences, and it can feel really overwhelming, like opening Pandora's box. The forgetfulness, on the other hand, holds this degree of oblivion, and the survivor will at first find themselves disbelieving their own memories and returning to that state of denial. So as quickly as they remember, they will forget again in this art of forgetting that has been cultivated over years of having to survive within that family system. But this forgetting serves no real purpose as an adult, and this fragmentation is not a sustainable way to live. It only serves to separate ourselves from ourselves. So the survivor will need to affirm and believe in their memories, and by doing so, that survivor will solidify and become a whole being. So as the survivor starts to heal, we'll start to see this shift from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you to ultimately what's right with you. This paradigm shift is really important. It moves the survivor from a place of despair to that of hope and healing. The survivor learns to identify these maladaptive responses and replace them with brain-building activities such as a growth mindset, positive affirmations. And another really helpful brain-building activity is reframing. Reframing is this strategy to cause you to look at situations from another perspective, and it involves combating cognitive distortions and false beliefs. But sometimes when working with survivors, it's your own perspective that needs to be reframed. Lack of acknowledgments for accomplishments and talents in childhood can lead to a high need for attention and affirmation in adulthood. So instead of viewing the survivor as attention-seeking, try telling yourself that they are connection-seeking. Instead of viewing them as lazy, try telling yourself that they are tired, their nervous system just exhausted from years of being elevated. Instead of labeling someone as procrastination, try viewing it as the fact that they are distancing themselves from stress. So when all this hard work is done, we see these benefits of mind calming and mind building strategy. We see increased productivity, memory solidification, creativity, social engagement, increased focus and attention, and reduced brain fog. So then we can define resiliency as not something that is created through predictable, not something that someone is born with, but something that is created through predictable problem solving in a safe space. So perhaps my least favorite saying is children are resilient, because unfortunately resiliency, just like anything else, is something that develops over time. It's not a bouncing ball. We absolutely cannot bounce back from struggle automatically without first having a baseline and learning how to get back to it. So your job will then be to help the survivor create that baseline for resiliency. So I want to take a moment to discuss separation or estrangement from family members, including the trafficker themselves. This is really tricky. The fact is that 75% of survivors will maintain contact with the trafficking parent well into adulthood, and that speaks volumes to how tricky this is. It is really typical to see harassment from disbelieving family members, including those non-abused siblings. The trafficking parent themselves will absolutely stalk the victim, typically being able to gain access to their whereabouts simply by identifying themselves as the parent. In addition, society does a fantastic job of demeaning people who are not family-oriented or estranged from other family members, and this is an idea that is internalized by the adult survivor. So to combat this, we must normalize separation from toxic family members. This process will involve a whole lot of grief, but it can be buffered by the hope that separation is merely a phase in the relationship and a door can be left open, possibly for family members to engage at a later date in a therapeutic setting. So even if the family member themselves is not toxic, the survivor might also choose estrangement from them simply because the trafficking parent can harass that non-abusive family member into giving away their location. Either the way, the choice to remain in contact or to break contact is the survivor's and theirs alone. They will make that decision for themselves when the time is right, and it should not be rushed or forced. It is okay, though, to suggest and normalize and absolutely be a listening ear during the grieving process. For me, separation from my family was perhaps the most painful part of this healing journey. So we can think about all these risk factors: social isolation, financial insecurity, parents with untreated mental health conditions, substance abuse disorders, and domestic violence. All of these things are on the rise. They have been since the 2020 lockdown. It is absolutely safe to assume that the trafficking of our nation's very young children have also spiked unbeknownst to us. So what can we do as a community to combat this? We can drop the idea that some families and locations are immune for trafficking. There are reasons to believe that certain locations are hotbeds for this activity, as identification is hampered by a lack of awareness, training, and expertise. Train stakeholders in the presentation of developmental trauma specifically and familial trafficking. There is a need for a community to acknowledge that family members absolutely do profit off of selling their children this way. Make sure your child welfare personnel then is not operating in a vacuum without the specialized training to identify these cases and to accurately label them. Increase awareness surrounding family trafficking by ensuring that any anti-trafficking presentation includes this topic and is not glossed over. Too often, survivors attend a presentation on human trafficking and are unable to identify as it does not relate to their own experiences. Don't stop at just identifying for learning disabilities and attention differences. Get to the root cause by screening for dissociation. That, combined with this high rate of frequent visits to the school nurse, high absentee rate, and a disengagement or an over-engagement with activities, school and district hopping, and other manipulations like homeschooling and virtual learning. Parents who are identified as substance dependent should absolutely be screened for familial sex trafficking involvement, remembering that this type of trafficking is likely to include a third party who is then circulating their lives in hopes of gaining access to the child's dependency, to the child through the drug dependency. Believe children and honor their boundaries even when they are really vague. Label sex trafficking and not just sex abuse. This is important for a lot of reasons. It's helpful for prevalence. Offenders receive punishments that are compatible with their crimes. And the victim is properly to understand their experiences, framing it appropriately, and seeking out appropriate services. Please provide a host or surrogate family for familial survivors. Too often, these survivors regress during holidays as they're just bombarded by images of happy families during this time of year, and that then increases those feelings of grief and isolation. So a family that involves a survivor in their holiday celebrations can help mitigate these triggers. Even receiving a birthday card or a Christmas card in the mail can help. So please remember just a few things upon leaving here. If nothing else, remember that trafficking can happen anywhere in any kind of family. There is no family or location that is immune to trafficking. 2, establish a long-term trust-based relationship with chronically distressed children. You can absolutely make a difference in a child's life by being their safe person. Always believe a child and honor their boundaries regarding people and places. And lastly, a word for survivors out there. You can keep going. It is really hard to come to terms with the evil that you were born into. But there is good and kindness out there too. So don't give up and don't let this experience define you as a person. It is possible to recover. It just takes dedication, perseverance, and a little help from others. So that includes everything today. If you would like to download handouts for this presentation, you can visit my blog here at safeforus.org/blog/information. The handouts were also uploaded into the WOVA app, and you can download them there. I was hoping for Q&A time and also to read a poem to y'all, but I think we are out of time for today. So I'm happy to stay.